I'm just walking through the underground at this point. It's known as the Metro in Amsterdam, and I'm on my way today to see the Rijksmuseum. I hope I'm saying that right. The Rijksmuseum is a large building dating from the 1880s, which was built to house the treasures of the Netherlands in a similar way to the Louvre in France. Now you can see from the outside they're very fond of Vermeer, and they actually have a separate Vermeer exhibition, which I didn't buy a ticket to see. Inside you have a central court. Here's a statue of the Laocoon and his sons, a famous Greek statue which has been reinterpreted many times over the centuries. And here you have the god Bacchus out on a night out. I think you might be able to see a horn of wine somewhere. The history of the Netherlands goes back quite a long way. Originally it was ruled by the Dukes of Burgundy, who were medieval dukes who ruled quite a large area, including what's now Luxembourg, Belgium and the Netherlands. And these were quite Catholic rulers. You can see here some narwhal horns, which were officially labelled as unicorn horns and held in a church as an emblem of purity. You've also got a shield of Charlemagne here because there was a French influence. Now, this kingdom later passed into the hands of the Habsburgs, who were very Catholic rulers of medieval Europe, and here you can see reliquaries, croziers, and all the rest of the traditional high church bling. During the time of the Habsburgs, there were several wars. Here you can see storming of a town, but the Netherlands would ultimately secede from the Habsburgs, partly due to matters of Calvinist faith, and partly due to other reasons, and it was ruled by a series of local dignitaries. A tradition for local dignitaries was to have a diptych of the husband and the wife painted here. You can see this sort of black formal dress shows how these individuals viewed themselves not as dukes or Catholic monarchs, but just as upstanding citizens who ruled the state. The Netherlands became incredibly wealthy at this time, free trade and manufacture. Here you have some glassware which was previously confined to Venice, but at this time what was known as the Northern Renaissance was going on, and a artistic style inspired by developments in Italy for realism was beginning to spread across the north of Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, where a lot of wealthy traders were able to commission fine paintings such as these. Now, trade back in the early Middle Ages involved ships, and the Netherlands, which had only recently been formed around 1579 or so, moved to possess one of the finest navies in Europe at the time. And here you can see some famous sea battles, often, I've got to admit, against the English and later the British, and the Dutch actually tended to do quite well, although they eventually lost. Here's a scale model of one of their big warships which may have involved in these skirmishes against the accursed English. The skill of the Dutch sailors was really something. One of their most famous admirals, Martin Tromp, fought on after his ship had been sunk by moving to a ship that he'd captured. At the heart of the museum is this library, which is still available to be used today as a reference library. There are thousands of historic books. The building itself wasn't constructed until the 1880s, but some of these books here are much older, and it's a really nice and quiet, tranquil place at the heart of this busy museum. The 1600s were a golden period for the Dutch. In this period, they didn't have a stadtholder, which is their term for a king or a formal ruler. It's made up of several provinces, but at one point they appointed an overall leader, and this was this man here, Johan de Witt. He focused a lot on the navy but neglected the army, and eventually the French invaded by land and succeeded in taking large parts of the Netherlands, at which point they were forced to sue for peace, but the terms were such that the Dutch maintained some of their former colonies and a lot of their trading prestige, and so they didn't suffer too badly for the rest of the 16 and 1700s. There was a lot of money around for middle class people, including for women to make these elaborate dolls' houses, which would have been a sign of great prestige. This room is decorated in the French style around the time of Louis XIV. You can see it's much more ostentatious than the restrained Calvinist influenced Dutch style which is seen in the other rooms. Even while all these wars were raging in Europe, the Dutch did a lot of trade in the Far East with Japan, where they were one of the few countries permitted to trade, and also with Indonesia, which was done under their control as the Dutch East Indies. And you can see from that lacquerwork cabinet, we've just seen that there were quite exotic pieces being shipped out. This central hall has paintings which were done in the 1880s, telling the story of key events in the Netherlands' history. You'll see one in a minute showing the Christianization of the Frisians, which was the tribes of people who were here before the Netherlands became a state. You can see there. And there's several of Dutch kings over the years, and on the windows here you have great artists and sculptures of history, like Apelles, the Greek sculpture. So it's really a shrine to show how the Netherlands was made, and especially how its art was made. On the ground floor you've got works from the 19th and early 20th centuries, and this was a great time for art. You can see here this piece that was inspired by Van Gogh, perhaps more technically advanced in some respects. This was a time when Eastern influences were really pouring into the West, and you can see these vases, the Japanese and colourful influence of the Dutch East Indies on them. Just before World War I think was probably the finest time for art in world history. You had so many great artists working, and the patronage system of the church and the aristocracy hadn't broken down. But of course, not everything was perfect in the world at this time, and you can see from these images what life was like if you're unfortunate to be working in one of the colonies. It would be a lot less pleasant, particularly if you were a native. So, you can be thankful. Perhaps you don't have as good art, but perhaps we made progress in other areas today. Now, as well as the late 19th century, there's also pieces here from the early 19th century. In this period, there was a focus on still lifes in art, and it might have been nice to have some tranquility because politically this was a very tumultuous time for Europe. Napoleon was taking over large swaths of Europe, and Napoleon here you can see on the right, the Emperor of France made his brother on the left, who was Louis Napoleon, referred to in that flag as King of the Netherlands. Now, Louis Napoleon actually was a champion of the Netherlands, and he saluted his brother several times, which meant he wasn't too unpopular with the native Dutch, but he obviously had to go, and his brother went as well during the Battle of Waterloo, which you can see on this picture here, which was actually fought in or near the Netherlands by the Duke of Wellington and co, who beat Napoleon and finally exiled him to a remote island. I'm heading back into the gallery to look at some paintings from the Dutch Golden Age of Vermeer and Rembrandt. Some of these works are exceptionally well painted, and they typically depict the Dutch middle class. At this time, as mentioned, the Dutch were taking over from the Habsburg emperors and running their own things, and there were citizens' militias, such as this one you can see here, and one you're about to see in a second, which is Rembrandt's The Night Watch, one of the most famous paintings in the world, which represent this age quite clearly. Currently, some work is ongoing to renovate the painting, which you can see here. These works represent rich members of the Society of Amsterdam and the Netherlands, and here we have the wardens of the Drapers Guild, the drapers being one of the wealthiest of the merchants of Amsterdam. These works in this corner are all by Rembrandt, probably the most famous painter of this era in the Dutch Golden Age. Speaking of drapers, the Netherlands were also an important location in this period for tapestries and other forms of cloth weaving. These cloths were exported all around the world. Here you can see a map of Spain, which would have helped Dutch navigators to find their way around. During this period, the Dutch upper middle class can enjoy food from all over the world. And similarly, their furniture could come from exotic locations, new hardwoods being brought into Europe for the first time. Dutch colonies were set up all around the globe, such as this one here in India, which was later given to the British, and this one in Africa. The Dutch also had territories out in the West Indies, as you can see from this diptych here, from two rich landowners. And while they were there, they produced drawings of the local flora and fauna, such as this one of peacocks. These drawings of birds and exotic plants and animals occupy an interesting space between what we now consider as science and also as art. The works are truly spectacular, and you can imagine books which contain prints like these being incredibly expensive at the time. A few of the interiors from the Dutch Golden Age have been lifted wholesale and put inside the Rijksmuseum. You can see from the high stucco ceilings and the ornate windows that this was a time of great prosperity for the Netherlands. Lacquerware and other works from Japan and the Far East were flowing into the country, making it rich and prosperous. The Dutch also had ambassadors to Turkey, and you can see from this room, which is devoted to those missions to Turkey and trading, that they truly went all over the world. But time has to set on every golden age, and as the Dutch were increasingly muscled out of their overseas territories by the British and the French, soon their galleons and their fleets shrank, and they were no longer a major world power as they had been during the Golden Age for a brief period. On the ground floor of the museum is an extensive collection of arms and armour. These guns, which would have been part of the local militias, were viewed as something like a sports car. If you could afford a really fancy one, they would be passed down and flaunted for generations. Probably the most lasting benefits to have come out of the Netherlands Golden Age for the country today has been its technology, as shown in these instruments, and also in the locks and fine craftsmanship. This skilled industry is what has made the country so developed today and such a pleasant place to spend some time. The centre of town today isn't filled with merchants trading bags of cloth, but with finance workers, software engineers, and other technology specialists. I'll leave you with the last few shots of the Netherlands, including this cat looking out of the window. It's quite adorable. And also this building here, which is the architectural centre, but it can't even have straight windows itself. Finally, a last shot of walking down the canal on my way back to England. See you soon for more adventures.